Have you ever been made to feel invisible in a place where you knew you belonged? Imagine sitting in first class, not by accident, but because you earned every right to be there, yet being denied the simplest gesture of respect. For Dr. Naomi Caldwell, a powerful black CEO. The journey began with silence, then humiliation, and finally, a choice to accept the indignity, or stand tall and demand change. But what happens when the people meant to serve you cross the line from neglect into open disrespect? And what if the person they underestimated turned out to hold more power than anyone on that plane could imagine? If it were you, would you have the strength to rise above anger, to act not just for yourself, but for everyone who has ever been dismissed? Or would you stay quiet, hoping the moment would pass? This is not just a story about one woman. It's a story about dignity, courage, and the power of one voice to spark a movement. Stay with us, and before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss stories that matter, stories that change the way we see the world. The first-class cabin glowed with a soft amber light, the kind that wrapped itself around leather seats and glass panels until the entire space felt hushed and insulated from the world. The steady hum of the aircraft's engines created a rhythm almost like a lullaby. Steady, calm, reassuring. For many passengers, this was a place of luxury and rest. But for Dr. Naomi Caldwell, the calm only made her heartbeat sound louder in her own ears. Naomi had boarded this flight with one hope piece. After weeks of back-to-back board meetings, investor calls, and late nights drafting proposals, she wanted nothing more than a few hours of quiet at 35,000 feet. She had chosen a window seat, buckled in, and set her phone on airplane mode, already imagining the relief of being unreachable for a while. Naomi was not just another business traveler. At 46, she was the founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar aerospace technology company that supplied engines to half the world's airlines. Her life had been one long climb up a mountain of skepticism. Skepticism about her gender, her race, her worth. And though she had long ago proven her brilliance, she never forgot what it felt like to be underestimated. That memory returned quickly, in a subtle moment. The flight attendant Claire Donovan moved gracefully down the aisle, distributing headphones to each first-class passenger. She leaned politely toward a man in seat 2A, offered a bright smile, and placed the sleek noise-canceling headset into his waiting hands. She did the same with the couple seated just across from Naomi, her tone cheerful, practiced, professional. When she reached Naomi's row, Claire's smile thinned. She glanced down at Naomi, hesitated just for a beat, and then kept walking. Naomi blinked, certain she must have imagined it. Perhaps Claire had run out of headsets and would return in a moment. Perhaps she had been distracted. But seconds stretched long, and Naomi realized she had been skipped. It was such a small thing. A headset, something that cost the airline less than a dinner entree. But in that tiny omission, Naomi felt the sting of something much larger. She had felt it before in boardrooms where her ideas were ignored until repeated by a man, in interviews where her achievements were doubted, in subtle jokes that questioned her right to lead. She had risen above it each time. And yet, here it was again, on a plane. She had helped make possible through the very engines her company designed. Naomi straightened in her seat, inhaling slowly. She told herself not to overthink, not to read into it. But when Claire returned moments later with another set of headphones, this time handing them to a man who had just boarded late, Naomi noticed the smirk curling at the corner of her lips, a deliberate choice, The realization sat heavy in her chest. The cabin around her was calm, serene, almost indulgent. But inside Naomi, a storm began to gather. She turned her gaze toward the window, letting her eyes rest on the tarmac lights flickering against the dusk. The plane vibrated gently as luggage was loaded below. She thought of the hundreds of employees she led, the thousands of families who depended on Caldwell Dynamics for work. She thought of the young women of color who often wrote to her, calling her a role model, saying that her journey gave them hope. And then she thought of how, even here, in a seat she had paid for, in a cabin she had earned entry into, she was being reminded subtly, sharply, that her presence was still questioned. Her jaw tightened. "Would you like something to drink?" Claire's voice startled her. The attendant stood there, tray in hand, eyes cool, tone clipped. "Yes, water, please." Naomi's reply was calm, steady, practiced. Claire handed the glass with a stiffness that barely masked disdain. And once again, she moved on as if Naomi were invisible. Naomi set the water on her tray table, fingers lingering on the cool glass. For a fleeting second, she thought about letting it all slide. She could spend the flight in silence, ignore the insult, enjoy the clouds. But the smirk, the tone, the omission, it wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been told, in subtle ways, that they didn't belong. Her pulse quickened. This was not going to be an ordinary flight. The plane lifted from the runway with a subtle shudder, the seatbelt sign chiming above as passengers settled into their routines. In first class, the rituals of comfort unfolded, seatbacks reclining, champagne glasses raised, small talk drifting across the cabin like background music. Naomi Caldwell adjusted the cuff of her blazer and tried to ease into the rhythm of travel. She closed her eyes briefly, hoping the sting from earlier would fade into the drone of the engines. But peace did not come. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Claire Donovan returning down the aisle with a tray of beverages. Naomi steadied herself, determined to keep her composure. Claire approached the passenger in 1A, leaning close, her voice soft and attentive. She offered wine, even recommended a vintage, laughing lightly at a small joke. She moved to the couple in 1C and 1D, engaging them in conversation about their honeymoon, promising to bring an extra dessert as a treat. When she reached Naomi's row, her tone shifted. "What will it be?" Claire asked flatly, eyes darting quickly away. "Still water," Naomi said evenly. The glass clinked onto her tray table with none of the care given to the others. A bead of condensation slid down its side, pooling on the polished surface. Naomi's hand rested beside it, steady but deliberate. She noticed how Claire lingered a moment longer, as if daring Naomi to object, before moving on to the next passenger with her smile restored. It wasn't new to Naomi. She had walked through decades of rooms where the temperature changed the moment she entered, where courtesy was rationed, doled out to some freely, but withheld from her as if her very presence demanded proof. She told herself to breathe, to let the tension rise and pass. But it was not only Claire's behavior. Mark Reynolds, the purser and head of the crew, had been standing not far away. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. He had seen the difference in service. He had seen the deliberate slights. And yet he said nothing. Naomi shifted in her seat, pulling a small linen cloth from her bag to dab at the water ring forming on her tray. The smallest task gave her focus, grounding her in the moment, reminding her that she was in control of herself, if not of others. She sensed eyes watching. Across the aisle, A young woman glanced quickly, then looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. Naomi offered the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement. She had learned that many saw, but few acted. When dinner service began, the gap widened. Plates of seared salmon and roasted vegetables were delivered with charm and warmth to every row but hers. When at last Claire stopped before Naomi, her voice carried the cool edge of formality. Chicken or pasta? No smile, no flourish, no mention of the chef's recommendation or the dessert pairing. Only two clipped words. Chicken. Thank you, Naomi replied, her tone calm, as if rehearsed. The plate landed before her, and in that moment, a memory surfaced her first contract negotiation 20 years ago, where she was seated at a long table with 15 men in gray suits. The coffee had been poured for each of them, but skipped over her. The secretary had apologized, but Naomi remembered the smirk on one man's face, the way he whispered to another, as though the exclusion had been intentional. That day, she had chosen not to react. She had taken the meeting, won the deal, and left with victory in silence. But silence had a cost. Now, sitting thousands of feet above the ground, Naomi realized she could not pay that cost again. As the tray of bread passed, Claire accidentally brushed the edge of Naomi's glass, spilling water across the front of her blouse. Naomi froze. The cool liquid spread slowly, soaking the crisp fabric, dampening the edges of her blazer. For a moment, time stilled. "Oh, my apologies," Claire muttered, voice void of real regret. She thrust a napkin toward Naomi, her eyes almost daring her to accept the humiliation. Naomi took the napkin, dabbed calmly at the spreading stain, and said nothing. Not because she felt powerless, not because she intended to surrender, but because she understood something deeper. Claire was waiting for an outburst, for proof of stereotype, for Naomi to become the problem instead of the victim, and Naomi refused to give her that. She moved slowly, deliberately, folding the damp napkin, pressing it against the fabric until the worst of the stain was absorbed. Then she set it aside, hands resting on the armrests, posture tall, expression unreadable. The silence that followed was louder than any words she could have spoken. Across the aisle, the professor she had noticed earlier, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned slightly forward. His lips parted as if to say something, but then he paused, hesitating. Finally, he whispered across the space between them, his voice low and steady. "Are you all right?" Naomi turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. His expression was one of quiet solidarity, his concern genuine. "I'm fine," she said softly. Her voice carried steel beneath the calm. "I have my own way of handling this." The professor nodded, leaning back, his eyes lingering with a mixture of respect and sadness. Naomi returned her gaze to the window, watching the night sky open wide, dotted with scattered stars. Her reflection stared back at her, composed yet restless. She thought of the daughters of friends, of the interns she mentored, of every young woman who had written letters saying, "Because of you, I believe I can." She could not let this moment pass. The storm inside her had grown too strong. This was no longer about a headset. It was about dignity, about accountability, about drawing a line that could not be crossed again. And in the stillness of that cabin, Naomi Caldwell decided she would act. The cabin had grown quiet after dinner, a hush settling in as trays were cleared away and lights dimmed. Some passengers pulled out books. Others adjusted their seats, slipping headphones over their ears to retreat into music or movies. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee and warm bread. Naomi Caldwell sat upright, her blouse still damp from the earlier spill. The fabric clung uncomfortably to her skin, a constant reminder of the disdain laced through every interaction with Claire Donovan. She dabbed at it once more with the edge of her napkin, her movements slow, deliberate, controlled. Across the aisle, Professor Henry Wallace opened a worn leather notebook and began jotting down notes in tidy script. Though Naomi suspected his attention was still half on her, he had spoken only once, offering his quiet support. But his presence carried a weight Naomi did not take lightly. She wanted to believe the worst was behind her, that Claire's contempt had run its course. But sometimes malice arrived in increments, each one designed to chip away at dignity, to test how long someone would endure before breaking. The dessert cart rolled forward, silver trays glinting under the soft cabin lights. Claire's voice lifted again, warm and almost melodic as she offered choices to the other passengers. "Would you like the tiramisu or the cheesecake? Our chef recommends the tiramisu. It pairs beautifully with the port wine." The couple in 2C and 2D laughed, delighted, choosing both. Their plates arrived with flourishes, Claire's smile bright, her tone indulgent. When the cart reached Naomi's row, the air shifted once more. Claire's cheer faded, her voice clipped. "Dessert," she asked, as though the word itself were an inconvenience. Naomi's lips curved into the faintest smile, one born not of amusement, but of understanding. She had seen this theater too many times. "The cheesecake, please," she said quietly. Claire placed the plate down with a dull clatter, the utensil rattling against porcelain. She didn't ask about coffee or tea, didn't mention the wine. She simply turned and moved away, her attention already lavished on the next row. Naomi picked up the fork, cut into the cake, and took a bite. The flavor was rich, creamy, sweet, but in her mouth, it tasted of something else, something bitter. She tried to focus on her breathing, steadying herself, but her body betrayed her calm. A tightness coiled in her chest, her pulse quickening. She felt the weight of every eye that flicked toward her and then away. Passengers aware but unwilling to step into the current of injustice. The professor leaned slightly forward again, his voice a whisper just above the hum of the engines. "They see it too," he murmured. "Don't think they don't." Naomi nodded, her gaze fixed on the untouched corner of her plate. "I know," she replied. Her tone was calm, but the words carried an ache. It happened not long after. Claire reappeared with a bottle of red wine, moving down the aisle with practiced grace. She refilled glasses, making small talk, offering compliments, her smile returning for everyone else. When she reached Naomi's row, her steps slowed. She held the bottle loosely, almost carelessly, and as she leaned toward the man seated diagonally across, the bottle tipped. A stream of deep crimson splashed across Naomi's lap. Gas rippled through the cabin. The wine soaked into the fabric of her slacks, staining them a dark, spreading blotch that glistened under the lights. Naomi inhaled sharply, the shock of cold liquid stealing her breath for a second. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Claire said, her tone flat, her eyes betraying no regret. She thrust a wad of napkins at Naomi, her movements jerky, impatient. The professor sat forward, his chair creaking. "That was no accident," he said aloud this time, his voice carrying enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. Naomi froze, her hands hovering over the napkins. She could feel every heartbeat, every breath of the people around her. Some turned away quickly, unwilling to involve themselves. Others stared openly, their curiosity tinged with discomfort. Claire stood stiff, her expression taut, waiting for Naomi to explode, to lash out, to give her the out she wanted. But Naomi did not. Instead, she lifted her chin, her posture composed. She took the napkins, dabbed calmly at the spreading stain, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. She would not be made into a spectacle. "Are you all right?" the professor asked again, his voice louder now, unafraid. Naomi met his eyes. There was a flicker of gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that she had been seen. "I'm fine," she said softly. The words were steady, even though her chest burned with indignation. But inside, something shifted. It was no longer a question of whether Claire's actions were intentional. The public nature of the humiliation, the spill witnessed by every passenger, had turned subtle prejudice into undeniable aggression. Naomi felt the weight of it pressed down on her. She thought of her employees, of the young women who saw her as proof that they too could lead, of the countless letters from strangers who told her she gave them courage. She could not let this pass. She could not simply wipe away the stain and pretend it hadn't happened. Her phone buzzed faintly on the tray beside her, a reminder of the world beyond this cabin. A world where she wielded influence, where her voice carried weight. She looked down at it, her reflection mirrored in the dark screen, and in that reflection she saw not just herself, but everyone who had ever been diminished, questioned, dismissed. Her fingers hovered, hesitating. Then she made her choice. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and relentless, like a reminder that the world outside continued to move forward no matter what storms brewed inside. Naomi Caldwell sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her slacks still damp from the spilled wine. The stain had begun to dry into a darker shadow, a visible mark of humiliation she refused to let define her. Her breathing was calm, practiced, the kind she had learned long ago when meetings turned hostile or when reporters framed their questions to doubt her legitimacy. But beneath the steady rise and fall of her chest, her thoughts churned. Should she let it go? Should she swallow the indignity? Spend the rest of the flight staring at the stars outside her window, and arrive at her destination as if nothing had happened? Her mind argued both sides like attorneys in a courtroom. On one side, silence whispered seductively. It promised peace, avoidance, the comfort of invisibility. It told her that reacting would only escalate the tension, that passengers would shift in their seats uncomfortably, that she would be labeled difficult. On the other side, truth roared. It told her that silence was not neutral. It was complicity. It reminded her of the long years when she had stayed quiet, enduring microaggressions in conference rooms, on stages, at networking dinners, telling herself it was the price of progress. But silence had never been free. Naomi closed her eyes and let herself drift back, unwilling but unable to stop the flood of memory. She was 26 again, a junior engineer in a lab full of men who dismissed her designs as ambitious fantasies. She remembered how one had leaned back in his chair, smirking as he said, "We don't have time for experiments. Leave the real work to us." She had swallowed her anger, walked out with her dignity intact, but her spirit heavy. Later, when her design won a government contract worth millions, the same men had lined up to shake her hand, pretending they had believed in her all along. She was 32, seated at a venture capital meeting where an investor asked if her husband would be joining, assuming no woman could lead such a company alone. She had smiled politely, deflecting the insult, and then convinced him to write a check bigger than any he had signed that year. Victory had been hers, but she remembered the sting of being dismissed before she even opened her mouth. At 40, She had walked on stage at a global aerospace conference to polite applause, only to hear a man in the front row mutter, "She doesn't look like a CEO." That day, she delivered a keynote so powerful that the audience rose to their feet, but the words had lodged in her chest like a splinter that never quite healed. Every time she had chosen silence, she had survived. But every time, a part of her had paid a price. Naomi opened her eyes and stared at the reflection in the dark window beside her. She saw a woman who had climbed mountains no one thought she could scale. A woman who had built engines that lifted planes into the sky, who had created jobs for thousands, who had become a symbol of what was possible. And yet, tonight, in a cabin she had paid for, she was being asked again to carry the weight of disrespect. The professor across the aisle coughed gently, his notebook closed now, his gaze steady. She felt the warmth of his support, though he had spoken only sparingly. It reminded her that others were watching, that her response was not only for herself. Naomi's fingers traced the edge of her phone. Its screen was dark, but it might as well have been glowing with possibility. She knew the power she held. As a major partner and supplier for SkyNova Airlines, her voice could carry to the highest office before this plane even landed. But power was not the question. The question was whether she would use it. Her mind played out the scenarios. If she stayed silent, Claire would go home and perhaps laugh about it, dismissing the incident as nothing more than an inconvenience. Mark Reynolds would keep crossing his arms, letting silence excuse inaction. And the passengers would walk away with a memory of discomfort, telling themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. But if she acted, if she chose to shine a light on the truth, something could change. Not just for her, but for the next person who boarded this plane, for the next young woman who dared to dream of leadership, for the next passenger who deserved dignity regardless of the color of their skin. Naomi inhaled deeply. The hum of the plane seemed to recede, the air around her sharpening, as if the entire cabin leaned in to hear her decision. Her heart whispered enough. She would not let this slide. She would not carry the burden of silence any longer. Her thumb hovered over the screen of her phone, the contact list opening with a swipe. There it was, the direct number for Richard Coleman, CEO of SkyNova Airlines, the man who had once told her, "If you ever see something wrong with the way we run our flights, don't hesitate to call me. We need accountability at every level." She had never imagined she would take him up on that offer in the middle of a flight. But tonight, she would. Before she pressed the name, Naomi paused. She looked once more at her reflection in the glass, at the steady eyes staring back. She thought of her employees, of the young women who followed her path, of her late mother who used to whisper, "Stand tall, Naomi. The world will try to shrink you, but don't let it." Her thumb pressed down. The call began to ring. The faint glow of seatbelt lights shimmered above, casting the cabin in soft pools of gold and shadow. Most passengers had turned inward, settling into movies or sleep, their eyes shielded by screens or blankets. Yet the tension that hung in the air was undeniable, like a low current humming beneath the quiet. Naomi Caldwell's phone still rested in her hand, its screen dark now. The call ended. She had not yet spoken to Richard Coleman, but the connection was open in another sense. Her mind, her resolve. Something inside her had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her fingers trembled faintly before she folded them together in her lap. She wanted to be calm, to exude the dignity she had spent a lifetime mastering. But her pulse betrayed her, thudding against her ribs with a steady insistence. Across the aisle, Professor Henry Wallace leaned slightly forward. His silver hair gleamed under the cabin light. His eyes filled with a quiet intensity. He had been watching, not in judgment, but in solidarity. "You know," he said softly, his voice steady as if speaking from the lectern of some long-ago classroom, "I taught social history for 30 years. I spent a career studying how small acts of exclusion ripple into systems that last for generations." Naomi turned her head, meeting his gaze. His words were not a question, not even advice, but an offering. He continued, "What I saw here tonight wasn't small. It was deliberate, and it matters how you respond." Naomi's lips pressed together. She felt the truth of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. She wanted to argue that she had no obligation, that she was tired, that she deserved peace. But the professor's eyes held hers with such calm certainty that her arguments faltered before they could take shape. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, yet every syllable carried weight. "But sometimes I wonder why must it always fall to us? Why must we be the ones to fight, to stand, to carry the burden of teaching the world again and again?" The professor's expression softened, and for a moment he looked far older. The years etched into his face. "Because if not us, then who?" he said simply. "Each time we rise, it makes it harder for the next person to be pushed down. I've seen it. Change is slow, but it is real." Naomi inhaled deeply, her chest rising with the weight of his conviction. His words were not romantic or idealized. They were worn, lived in, carved from years of watching the same patterns repeat. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, leaning back, his hands folding over the leather notebook on his lap. "Whatever you decide, you won't be alone. I'll stand with you." The promise lingered in the air, not dramatic, but resolute. It gave Naomi a strange kind of strength, the kind that did not come from grand gestures, but from knowing someone else would shoulder a fraction of the weight. Claire Donovan passed by again, her steps brisk, her posture rigid. She did not meet Naomi's eyes, though her jaw was set, her shoulders tense. Mark Reynolds stood near the galley, his arms still crossed, his silence as heavy as ever. Naomi studied them both, her thoughts sharp. Claire's disdain had been the spark, but Mark's inaction was the accelerant. Silence had enabled cruelty. And Naomi realized that what she faced was not one person's prejudice. It was the quiet permission of those who refused to intervene. Her phone vibrated again, a faint buzz on the tray beside her. She glanced down. A message from Richard Coleman. "Call me when you're ready. I'll be waiting." Her throat tightened. The choice was hers now. Fully hers. She looked around the cabin, at the passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, aware yet unwilling. At the professor watching steadily, offering a silent nod of encouragement. At the reflection in her window, where her own face looked back at her, eyes weary but unyielding. Naomi thought of her late mother, who had worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat, who had once told her, "Naomi, dignity is not given, it is defended." Her decision crystallized. She would act, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in clarity, in truth. Her hand closed over the phone, not trembling now but steady, anchored. She pressed Richard Coleman's number again. When his voice answered warm, direct, unmistakably firm, Naomi spoke with precision. She recounted each slight, each humiliation, each deliberate act, her words crisp and unwavering. She did not exaggerate, did not raise her voice. She told the truth, and the truth was damning enough. By the time she ended the call, Her pulse had slowed, her breath steady again. The weight on her chest had eased, replaced by something else resolve, sharpened into steel. The professor caught her eye. "Well?" he asked gently. Naomi allowed the faintest smile. "This isn't over," she said. Her tone carried a quiet power, the kind that promised the story had only begun. The cabin lights dimmed to a softer glow, signaling the transition into the long, quiet stretch of the flight. Most passengers reclined into their seats, slipping into movies or half-sleep. The hum of the engines a steady blanket of sound. But for Naomi Caldwell, the silence had sharpened into focus. She sat upright, phone in hand, her gaze steady. Her call with Richard Coleman had been brief but electric, like a match striking dry tinder. He had listened without interruption, his voice taut with anger when she described Claire Donovan's dismissive words, the spilled water, the wine that soaked her clothes. He had asked for details, and she had given them all of them. And then his words had come like a promise. "Stay calm, Naomi. I'll handle this. Now." The weight of that promise hung in the air. Naomi's posture was composed, but every muscle in her body thrummed with anticipation. Something had shifted the moment she chose to act. The humiliation no longer belonged to her. It had been transformed into evidence, into testimony, into truth that could not be erased. Across the aisle, Professor Henry Wallace gave her a small nod, a gesture of affirmation. He hadn't asked for details, hadn't intruded, but the look in his eyes told her he knew, and that was enough. Claire moved past again, her footsteps brisk, her tray clinking with half-finished glasses. She avoided Naomi's eyes, though the stiffness in her jaw betrayed a trace of unease. The earlier confidence had thinned, replaced by something quieter, sharper awareness that her actions had been witnessed. Mark Reynolds lingered near the galley, arms still folded, his presence like a shadow. He glanced Naomi's way once, but quickly shifted his gaze, as though afraid of what he might find there. Silence, Naomi thought, was his shield, and shields eventually crack. The intercom crackled suddenly, pulling every ear in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice echoed, smooth but faintly strained. "Due to an operational matter, we'll be returning to the gate for a short delay before resuming our flight. Please remain seated." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Heads turned. Passengers exchanged questioning glances. A woman leaned toward her husband, whispering, "What happened?" Another man pulled out his phone, muttering about missed connections. Naomi sat still, her expression calm, her breathing even. She felt the shift not just in altitude, but in atmosphere. Richard Coleman had moved swiftly, decisively, and now the wheels of accountability had begun to turn. Claire's face paled slightly, though she masked it with a polite smile for a passenger's question. Mark's arms unfolded at last, his hand brushing against his tie, his jaw tightening. Professor Wallace leaned closer across the aisle, his voice low but clear enough for her alone. "That was you, wasn't it?" Naomi's lips curved faintly. "Not just me," she said softly, "but I had a hand in it." The professor chuckled under his breath, not in humor, but in admiration. "Good," he said. "Good." The cabin tilted slightly as the plane began its descent back toward the airport. The hum of the engines deepened, vibrating through the seats. Passengers straightened, some sighing in frustration, others staring out the windows. Confusion etched into their faces. Naomi kept her gaze forward, steady, unflinching. She thought again of her mother's words, of every young woman who had written to her, of every silent battle she had fought in rooms where no one else had spoken up. Tonight, she was no longer silent. As the plane rolled toward the terminal, the anticipation built. Naomi could feel it in the shifting energy of the cabin, the whispers, the darting glances, the unspoken questions. Something was coming. She pressed her palms lightly against the armrests, grounding herself, steadying her breath. She was not afraid. She was ready. The seatbelt sign chimed again. The plane slowed, easing toward the gate. Outside, lights glowed against the night, bright halos cutting through the darkness. And inside, in the hush before confrontation. Naomi Caldwell prepared herself. This was no longer about headphones, or spilled water, or wine stains. It was about accountability. It was about drawing a line so bold it could not be ignored. The moment was approaching. The plane rolled slowly across the tarmac, its lights glinting against the wet surface of the runway. Through the window, Naomi Caldwell could see ground crews moving hurriedly, guiding the aircraft back to its gate. The hum of the engines lowered to a steady rumble, a sound that felt less like progress and more like anticipation. Around her, passengers shifted restlessly. Some muttered about missed connections, others complained under their breath. The couple across the aisle looked at each other with concern, their voices hushed. A man behind Naomi pressed the call button, asking sharply, "What's going on? Why are we turning back?" Claire Donovan approached him with her polished smile, though it faltered at the edges. "Just a minor operational issue." "Sir," she said, "nothing to worry about." Her words were smooth, but Naomi saw the tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. Claire was rattled. Mark Reynolds moved down the aisle, speaking quietly with a few crew members. His usual stoic silence seemed heavier now, as though he knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. His eyes darted toward Naomi once, then quickly away. The cabin buzzed with whispers. Some passengers speculated about a mechanical problem. Others wondered if there had been a security threat. A few simply sat back, resigned to waiting, their expressions bored or tired. Only Naomi knew the truth. Her phone rested in her lap, its screen dark but still carrying the weight of Richard Coleman's voice. He had promised action, and action had come faster than she expected. The plane had not even left the ground before accountability had reached its doorstep. Professor Henry Wallace leaned slightly forward, his eyes searching hers. "This isn't standard procedure," he murmured. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "No, it isn't," she replied softly. He gave a small nod, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Good," he whispered. The plane eased to a stop at the gate. The familiar chime of the seatbelt sign turning off filled the cabin, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We'll be resolving an issue before we continue our journey. Thank you for your cooperation." The captain's tone was practiced, calm, but Naomi heard the strain beneath it. She knew that even in the cockpit, the ripple of this moment had reached. The door at the front of the cabin hissed as the jet bridge connected. The sound was unmistakable, the clank of metal, the faint vibration through the floor. Passengers craned their necks, curiosity sparking. It was unusual, this return, this interruption, and the energy in the air thickened with suspense. Naomi sat still, her back straight, her hands folded over her phone. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with clarity. She had chosen to act, and now the consequence of that choice had arrived. Claire moved briskly toward the galley, her steps sharp, her voice low as she exchanged hurried words with another crew member. Mark Reynolds stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture stiff as if bracing for impact. The door opened. Through it stepped two uniformed security officers, their expressions serious but composed. Behind them, unmistakable in his presence, was Richard Coleman. Gas rippled through the cabin. A few passengers sat up straighter, recognizing the CEO from magazine covers and interviews. Others whispered, "Who is that?" though the authority in his demeanor needed no introduction. Naomi watched him approach, her eyes steady. Richard's gaze swept across the cabin, landing on her for the briefest second. In that moment, acknowledgement passed between them, silent but profound. Claire's face drained of color. She took a step back, her polished mask slipping. Mark's jaw tightened, his silence suddenly exposed as complicity. The professor folded his hands over his notebook, leaning back slightly, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. He had seen history unfold in classrooms and courts, but rarely this close, this immediate. Passengers whispered louder now, some pulling out phones, others frozen in astonishment. The cabin, moments ago just another space of quiet luxury, had transformed into a stage where accountability was about to be demanded. Naomi inhaled slowly, her chest rising with the weight of the moment. She felt no triumph, no gloating, only a deep, steady resolve. This was bigger than her, bigger than the stain on her clothes, bigger than one woman's contempt. This was about dignity, about drawing a line, about making it clear that silence would no longer protect those who chose cruelty. Richard Coleman stopped in the aisle, his presence commanding the attention of everyone on board. His voice, when he spoke, carried a calm authority that filled the cabin. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies for the interruption, but there is a matter that must be addressed before this flight can continue." The words fell into the hush like stones into still water, sending ripples through every heart in the room. And Naomi knew the turning point had come. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the air system and the occasional click of a passenger's phone recording. Richard Coleman stood tall in the aisle, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, his expression both firm and apologetic. His arrival carried an undeniable gravity, one that drew every eye toward him. "Doctor." Naomi Caldwell did not move at first. She remained seated, her back straight, her gaze steady on the man she had spoken to only minutes earlier. Richard's presence here confirmed what she already knew: the time for silence was over. Claire Donovan stood near the galley, her polished veneer cracked. Her usual smirk was gone, replaced by a taut line of worry across her lips. Her eyes darted from Naomi to Richard, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Mark Reynolds shifted uncomfortably at the front of the cabin, his arms no longer crossed but hanging stiff at his sides, the weight of his inaction pressed down visibly on him. Richard's gaze swept the room once more before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth yet edged with steel, "I regret the disruption, but we cannot continue this flight until an urgent matter is addressed." Passengers leaned forward, curiosity sparking into open attention. Whispers buzzed in the back rows, a few phones lifted higher, recording with shaky hands. Richard turned toward Naomi. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, his tone warm but resolute. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention so swiftly." Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without breaking her composure. She could feel the stares of every passenger, the weight of being both witness and participant, but she refused to shrink beneath it. Richard faced Claire. "Claire Donovan, step forward." Claire hesitated, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles pale. When she finally moved, her steps were reluctant, as if each one dragged her closer to a truth she had hoped to avoid. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Richard asked. His tone was controlled, not raised, but its firmness left no room for evasion. Claire opened her mouth, words tumbling out in fragments. "It wasn't intentional. I didn't mean to. It was a long day." And Naomi rose from her seat, her movements slow, deliberate, unshaken. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through Claire's excuses with clarity. "This isn't about intent," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It's about impact. And the impact of your actions tonight was clear to everyone in this cabin." Her words echoed, firm yet calm, carrying the weight of lived truth. Passengers shifted, nodding subtly, some murmuring agreement. The professor across the aisle sat straighter, his eyes shining with respect. Claire's face flushed, her protests faltering. She turned toward Richard, but his expression remained unmoved. "Your behavior," Richard said, "violates the principles this airline stands for. Principles of dignity, equality, and respect, effective immediately. You are relieved of duty." Gas rippled through the cabin. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. Security officers stepped forward, their presence firm but not aggressive. They gestured gently, guiding her toward the door. Claire's polished composure crumbled fully now, her shoulders slumping as she walked down the aisle. Her head bowed under the weight of consequence. But Richard was not finished. "Mark Reynolds," he said sharply. The purser flinched at his name. His tall frame seemed to shrink under the spotlight of accountability. "You were present," Richard continued, his tone unwavering. "You saw the mistreatment, and you chose silence. Inaction in the face of injustice is complicity. For that, you too are suspended from duty, pending full review." Mark's lips pressed together, his eyes darting to the floor. He said nothing. The silence that had been a shield was now his condemnation. Naomi watched, her expression calm but resolute. This was not about punishment alone. It was about clarity, about drawing the line so boldly that no one could mistake it again. Richard turned back to the passengers. "I apologize for what you witnessed tonight. No customer, no human being, should ever be treated as less than deserving of respect. This is not who we are, and it will not be tolerated." The cabin filled with murmurs of agreement, nods from passengers who had felt the discomfort of silence, but now found relief in truth spoken aloud. A woman whispered, "Finally," as she lowered her phone, her recording complete. Naomi stepped forward into the aisle, her voice steady but gentle. "This isn't just about me," she said, her eyes sweeping the cabin. "It's about ensuring that no one else, on this flight or any other, is made to feel invisible, dismissed, or diminished. Dignity isn't negotiable. It is the baseline. And tonight, we make that clear." Her words lingered, heavier than the hum of the engines, heavier than the whispers. They hung in the air like a vow. Richard met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, "thank you for holding us accountable. Your courage has reminded us of the standard we must uphold." The professor across the aisle closed his notebook, his voice warm as he spoke into the hush. "History," he said softly, "is written in moments like these." Naomi returned to her seat, her movements unhurried, her posture tall. She did not smile, for this was not a victory to celebrate, but a truth to honor. She sat with quiet resolve, knowing this was only the beginning. The jet bridge remained connected as crew adjustments were made, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Where once there had been unease, Now there was acknowledgment, where once silence had weighed heavy. Now voices rose quietly, affirming that they had seen, they had understood. Naomi glanced out the window, the airport lights glowing against the dark. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, not triumphant, but steady, ready for what came next. She whispered to herself, words her mother had once told her, words that felt truer than ever. Stand tall, and she did. By the time the passengers finally disembarked, the airport terminal was alive with whispers. Word had traveled fast. A handful of clips recorded from seatbacks were already circulating on social media. The grainy footage capturing Claire Donovan's stiff posture, Richard Coleman's stern announcement, and Naomi Caldwell's steady voice as she reminded the cabin that dignity was not negotiable. Reporters were waiting beyond the gate. At first, just a few curious journalists who happened to be nearby. Then more arrived, tipped off by the viral swell already rising online. Microphones and cameras angled toward anyone willing to speak. Passengers shuffled past with wide eyes, some declining comment, others eager to share what they had witnessed. She was calm the whole time. One man said to a cluster of reporters, didn't raise her voice, didn't lose control. But you could feel it. What she said mattered. It shook the whole room. She stood up, not just for herself. A woman added, she stood up for everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong. Inside the terminal. Naomi walked with measured steps. She ignored the flashing cameras, the murmured questions thrown in her direction. Her slacks were still stained, the fabric stiff with dried wine, but she wore them as a badge now, a reminder of what had sparked the night's turning point. Professor Henry Wallace walked beside her, his notebook tucked under his arm. It's already out there, he murmured. People are talking. Naomi gave a small nod. They should. Behind them, Richard Coleman stayed close, flanked by security officers. His phone buzzed constantly, executives demanding updates, media outlets pressing for statements. Yet his focus remained on Naomi. You've started something tonight, he said quietly as they stepped into a quieter corridor. Naomi stopped, turning to face him. I didn't start it, she corrected. This has been building for years. I just refuse to let it pass again. Richard studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head. Then maybe you've given us the chance to finally do what we should have done long ago. The hours that followed blurred into a storm of coverage. By morning, headlines blared across major outlets. Black CEO demands accountability in first class. Airline flight interrupted over discrimination claims dignity is not negotiable. Says the Dwyer, Naomi Caldwell. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire online. Millions watched Richard Coleman relieve Claire Donovan of her duties, suspend Mark Reynolds, and apologize to passengers. But it was Naomi's words that echoed most calm, unwavering, impossible to dismiss. Commentators on morning shows debated what the incident revealed about bias in air travel. Advocacy groups praised Naomi's composure and courage. Former employees of multiple airlines shared their own stories online, some for the first time. The ripple had become a wave. In her hotel room, Naomi sat by the window, the city skyline glowing beneath the early sun. She held a cup of coffee, its warmth grounding her, though her mind buzzed with the weight of what had unfolded. She thought of her employees back at Caldwell Dynamics, who would wake to the news and see their CEO not in a boardroom, but in a viral video. She wondered what the young interns would think, whether they would see her not just as a leader of business, but as someone who refused to accept indignity quietly. Her phone vibrated with messages, dozens, then hundreds. former colleagues, old friends, strangers she had never met. Thank you for standing up. I've been in that seat before, and I stayed silent. You gave me hope. My daughter watched your video this morning and said, "That's who I want to be when I grow up." Naomi read them slowly, one by one. She felt the ache of recognition in each message, the shared wound of being unseen, dismissed, diminished, yet threaded through them all was something brighter: relief, gratitude, hope. Professor Wallace called that afternoon. His voice was warm, steady. "I've been asked for interviews," he said, almost chuckling. "Apparently my old lectures are relevant again." Naomi smiled faintly. "You are always relevant, Professor." He grew quiet, then added, "What you did, it mattered. Not just to me, to a lot of people. You know that, don't you?" Naomi stared out the window, the city sprawling below. "I know," she admitted softly. "But it's not enough to matter. It has to change something. And change was already coming." Richard Coleman held a press conference that evening, outlining immediate steps, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, a new system for anonymous passenger reporting, and an independent oversight board to review complaints. His words were firm, his tone resolute. "This industry must be better," he said. "We will be better." Some were skeptical, calling it damage control. Others saw it as the beginning of a new standard, but either way, the conversation had shifted, and there was no turning back. Naomi chose not to attend the press conference. Instead, she spent the evening in quiet reflection. She remembered her mother's hands, rough from work yet gentle as they guided her through childhood. She remembered the first time she walked into a classroom where no one looked like her, and the determination that burned even as the whispers tried to shrink her. She remembered every boardroom where she had been questioned, and every victory that proved them wrong. This, she realized, was part of the same journey. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The stain on her blouse remained faintly visible. Despite her best attempts to wash it out, she let it stay. Not as a blemish, but as a reminder. Tomorrow, she would board another plane. Tomorrow, she would face the world again. But tonight, she allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The world had seen her. More importantly, they had heard her. And somewhere, she knew, a young girl would watch that video and whisper to herself, "If she can, maybe I can too." 2 days later, the terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm. Rolling suitcases clicked against the floor. Announcements echoed through the air, and travelers hurried past one another in the timeless ballet of departures and arrivals. Dr. Naomi Caldwell stood quietly near Gate 32, her carry-on beside her, a boarding pass in her hand. She wore a fresh navy suit, crisp and immaculate, her composure undisturbed. The stain that had once marked her clothes was gone, but the memory of it, what it symbolized, remained etched into her mind. She glanced at the boarding pass again. SkyNova Airlines, first class, seat 2A. The irony did not escape her. 2 days ago, this company had nearly failed her. Tonight, they had another chance. A flight attendant approached, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "Good evening, Dr. Caldwell. We're honored to have you on board with us tonight." She extended a pair of headphones with both hands, her smile warm, her tone sincere. Naomi accepted them slowly, feeling their weight, their simplicity. She looked into the woman's eyes and saw no trace of condescension, no shadow of dismissal, only genuine respect. "Thank you," Naomi said softly. As she walked down the jet bridge, she felt the hush of the past days settle into perspective. The cameras, the headlines, the messages, it was all still swirling out there. But in this narrow tunnel of light leading into the plane, there was something simpler, a reminder of why she had acted. Inside the cabin, passengers glanced up as she entered. A few recognized her immediately. Their whispers carried a quiet reverence. One man leaned toward his wife and murmured, "That's her, the woman from the video." His wife nodded, her eyes soft with admiration. Naomi took her seat, placing the headphones carefully on her lap. She breathed in deeply, letting the hum of the engines ground her once more. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Tonight's flight will be smooth, and we thank you for choosing SkyNova Airlines." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Smooth. Perhaps not for the world outside, where conversations had been stirred, truths unearthed, and systems forced to confront their flaws. But for this moment, on this plane, smooth was enough. She thought of Richard Coleman, whose public commitments had set expectations higher than ever. She thought of Claire Donovan and Mark Reynolds, whose silence and actions had cost them everything. She thought of Professor Henry Wallace, whose words reminded her that history was shaped by those who refused to let silence win. And most of all, she thought of every person who had written to her, whose stories of humiliation and hope filled her inbox, whose quiet thanks reminded her that she had not stood alone. The plane began to taxi, rolling steadily toward the runway. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt, her gaze fixed on the window. Lights blurred across the tarmac, streaks of gold and white against the darkness. When the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, she felt her chest rise with it. She was not just leaving the ground, she was carrying something higher, heavier, brighter. She whispered to herself, just loud enough for her own ears, "Dignity is not negotiable." The words steadied her. They had steadied millions already. Hours later, as the cabin lights dimmed and passengers drifted into sleep, Naomi leaned back and finally slipped on the headphones. The soft hum of music filled her ears, wrapping her in calm. She let herself rest, not because the fight was over, but because she knew she had the strength to continue it tomorrow. Somewhere in the rows behind her, a passenger pulled out their phone, scrolling through a news article that quoted Naomi's exact words. The headline read, "One voice, many echoes. How Dr. Naomi Caldwell sparked an industry reckoning." And though Naomi did not see it, she felt the truth of it in her bones. The echo had begun. The ripple had become a wave. And the flight forward, the true flight, was only just beginning. The story of Dr. Naomi Caldwell is more than an incident on an airplane. It is a mirror for all of us. At its heart lies a simple truth. Dignity is not negotiable. Too often, prejudice and silence work together, eroding respect in the smallest of ways until they become heavy burdens on people's lives. Naomi's strength reminds us that when injustice appears, even in subtle or everyday forms, the choice to speak up matters. For older generations, this lesson resonates deeply. Many have seen moments in their lives when silence allowed unfairness to persist. Yet Naomi's calm, steady action shows us that courage does not always roar. It can also speak with quiet authority. Meng. She teaches us that every act of standing firm, every refusal to shrink, can inspire others and change the culture around us. In life, we may not all find ourselves in first class on an airplane, but we all know what it feels like to want respect, to want to be seen. Naomi's story urges us to protect that right for ourselves and for others. The message is timeless. Treat others with dignity, and never let silence shield cruelty. Thank you for watching and for sharing this moment with us. Stories like this matter because they remind us of who we are and who we can choose to be. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you powerful stories of resilience, justice, and hope. Together, we can keep the conversation alive and inspire change.